journal. So we see visual journaling as an art-based inquiry process that uses images, text, and other media in a physical journal. And this other media really can be anything that you can think of to use to help yourself express yourself, that can be put on a journal page. So magazine pages, newspaper clippings, paint, drawings, photographs, really anything. And visual journaling can be open-ended or cultivated using invitational prompts. So Leishvik and Springay are quoted here saying, visual journals enable teachers and students to make meaning and inquire creatively in a space that respects the self and others. And Theresa Redmond, who you're going to hear from soon, adds onto this idea, highlighting how, when used with critical media literacy, visual journaling helps to disrupt interpretive power structures and classroom decoding exercises, while also encouraging students to negotiate identities, culture, economics, and personal experiences. So I'm turning it over to Theresa to bring us into media as systems of socialization.
Thank you, Jewel, and welcome again, everyone. As Jewel mentioned, the Creativity Collaborative includes other members, and Tempestt Adams, who couldn't be with us today, has prepared a brief video to describe media as systems of socialization. It's quite short. As you're watching, pay attention to the example that she provides, which is from headlines that were disseminated during the middle of the 2000s during Hurricane Katrina. And as you pay attention to this headline, in particular, examine the language and reflect on the language used, and consider this idea that media contain and convey values and ideologies, and in this function as systems of socialization. And we'll have an opportunity to look at that particular image after this video.
Media as systems of socialization. The things we read, the things we watch, the music we listen to, they all contribute to the ways that our views about people and many other beliefs and practices come to be. When I think about this question, these are the images that come to mind first.
So in this video example, Tempestt invites us to consider media as systems of socialization, and in particular to personalize this. What media have we particularly felt impacted by in terms of our own identity development? And we'll have a chance to discuss this in the first round of discussion, as Jewel had mentioned when she went over the agenda. So this is the image that Tempestt included. And if you take a look at the, I'm not sure how your screens are set up, but you can, I believe, move to increase the size of the slide, but you can see the Associated Press has included language of looting in reference to victims of Hurricane Katrina gathering supplies. And in other news correspondence at the time, folks of were noted as finding. And so this language is very important, and in particular references the way that news media and language is a construction that creates and contributes to understandings of race in the United States. And again, keep this in mind as we'll come into this in the active negotiation segment. So I'll turn to Jewel now, and she'll talk about some examples of negotiating media.
So one way that we've explored negotiation and disruption in media is through a library science collection development course that Jennifer Luetkemeyer, one of the collaborative members, teaches. So one of Jennifer's sessions involves cataloging info the process of cataloging in library science involves the input of metadata into the system such that items are discoverable by patrons. However, the use of subject headings and keywords can be really problematic, and this has been a topic of discussion in her collection development class each year. So Jennifer brings in Dr. Dawn Betts-Green, who's a radical cataloger in our field, who describes for the class the evolution of LGBTQIA subject headings from being categorized as mental health disorders to being reassigned to categories with more inclusive language. And as Dr. Betts-Green takes students through the history of cataloging, they gain an understanding of how metadata in the library catalog is negotiated and fluid rather than static. And so this speaks to the need for a more critical view, not just on the media we engage with, but the way we describe it to make it findable. And this directly ties into Safia Noble's algorithms of oppression. Our algorithms in library and information science are people who sometimes actively infuse bias into keywords for you all, researchers and students, to use to search materials. So I also guest lecture in Jennifer's class, and in this lecture, I talk about authentic representation and inclusive text selection for K-12 school libraries and K-12 classroom libraries. Part of the session covers some of the common racial stereotypes and biases that have persisted in youth media, particularly in picture books. So I highlight examples like If I Ran the Zoo from Dr. Seuss, which stereotypes a variety of racial groups, including this one spread that you can see African people who are anthropomorphized and are as represented as half-closed monkeys. So using very explicit racist depictions and moving from that to highlight more modern texts that culturally appropriate, like Skippy John Jones, which portrays a cat becoming a chihuahua bandit who then proceeds to add O's to the ends of his words to create an appropriated Spanish language, and travels to Mexico to find a Chihuahua gang. They talk about liking rice and beans, and they wreck mayhem, which further pushes a stereotypical view of Mexican culture. And this is by far a very popular picture book that is still being checked out today in our collection and being used in classrooms. So I encourage students to view all media, especially youth media, to view it with a critical eye. And this requires moving past typical literature evaluation criteria that focuses on elements like plot, character, pacing, moving into more of a critical multicultural analysis approach that disrupts the traditional interpretation of text by looking at various cultural elements in terms of authentic and inauthentic representation, social constructs, relationships, and power, and also invites critical questions that help illuminate historically marginalized and disempowered experiences. And so Jennifer incorporates visual prompts, visual journaling prompts in all of her library science sessions. And I ended my session with a visual journal prompt for students, encouraging them to consider their own relationship with reading as youth. And the examples that Jennifer and I personally created to share with our students are shared here. And they provide a bit of interrogation of how some of the books we read in the past were problematic and or not representative of our own cultural identities. So this image here is Jennifer's journal, and this is her written description. The image of the girl on the left illustrates how, when I was young, I always had my head buried in a book, to the point that a friend would walk me to class so that I didn't bump into anyone. On the right, I've chronicled my journey through reading from my first ever book that I read on my own, Whose Mouse Are You?, to the genre I fell in love with in high school, fantasy. You can see that I've included the Little House on the Prairie books as part of my journey, even though they are problematic. Rather than denying their importance to my childhood, I recognize how they resonated with me while also acknowledging the harm they might do to others. The image is a good reminder of how our relationship with media is constantly disrupted and reimagined. And so my journal page from this prompt shows that I had a big imagination as a child. I was a big reader mostly of speculative fiction. I read things like Redwall, Mindstorms, Mercedes Lackey, Goosebumps, Into the Land of Unicorns, and Where the Red Fern Grows. And on the moon here, we have The Farthest Away Mountain, which is about a young girl who goes on this journey to find her prince. And I wanted to be her, but I couldn't be her. I didn't have long blonde hair and I wasn't white. And although I was a happy child who loved reading these books and escaping into fiction, looking back, I know now that it was internalized and shaped who I imagined could be a hero. And so when I guest lectured for this class again this year, I thought about how I might add to this prompt to reclaim and reimagine my story, and how publishing in youth literature is slowly changing to be more inclusive. And we have more Black fantasy for youth now than we ever have before. So I used an illustration from a local artist, Geneva Bowers, who draws these really amazing fantasy and science fiction illustrations featuring mainly girls of color. And I played with the image a bit digitally to represent what that little girl from before could have now if she could retell and reimagine her own story with more representative and inclusive youth literature. So seeing herself empowered in her own adventure. So with these examples in mind and the socialization video before, I want to take some time to turn and chat with you and offer you a space for discussing with each other around these two questions. How have you recognized media as systems of socialization, and how have you cultivated active negotiation to disrupt media systems in your work? And so we'll have about, let me check the time. Oh, great, we're like perfect on time. We'll give you about 10 minutes to discuss. Feel free to join the conversation using the chat or unmute your mics if you'd like to talk to us. And Theresa has put the questions into the chat too.
Personally, I have recognized a lot of media systems of my socialization when in my early years of beginning teenagehood, and I realized that a lot of my friends started communicating me solely through social media outlets. And that was my drive to actually download social media apps such as Snapchat and Instagram, which I was not a user of. And so I think it's really fascinating to see these very large tech companies that are now giant conglomerates of each other, that are really pushing social interaction through the younger generations, through their applications, and seeing how specifically image culture is very easily processed and not really analyzed at all. And we have this lack of critical analysis because we just go onto our app and we have these instant messages to try and not internalize, not realize we're unconsciously internalizing them, but understanding that, it's somehow affecting our life every single time we get a notification from our friend that brings us back to that app. And now we have things on social media such as Snapchat, where you have these giant news organizations that are with ads now. They did not have ads previously. I don't know if anyone's noticed this, but there are several ads. You cannot go to a quote unquote show that's on Snapchat or some type of video on Snapchat or media on Snapchat without seeing an advertisement. And how it's now intrinsically involved with our communication is watching advertisements and having commercials within our media on our phones. It's no longer on the television. We have it on our phones every day without even realizing it. And the majority of our younger audiences are seeing these advertisements, not realizing it. And there's even a feature on them where you can change the setting to I didn't like this ad was not for me, don't want to see ads like this as much, which is also an interesting thing that might play into the algorithm. So I found that really fascinating to see how I didn't even realize I was being hooked into this social media culture, and before I knew it, I was entrenched into what is now being created, the reality for especially the younger generation of how to view the world, especially in politics in this day and age.
Do others relate, or how might others relate to this idea of a creative reality, which Amy comments on?
Well, I can discuss because my mind is focused on a presentation that I have to give on Monday. And I focus on question number one: how have you recognized media as systems of socialization? I'm looking at the history of children's picture books, and my talk on Monday is about white supremacy in children's picture books with a focus on African American children and the impact of this type of media on the psychology of both the white child as well as the black child to see images that are caricatures of humanity. So I'll share a couple of books with you from my collection that I'm talking about. This is Little Black Sambo, right? This is an image of Little Black Sambo. This is an image of nursery comics. And then again, we have the image of Little Black Sambo. So we're talking about representation, authenticity, propaganda. What's the purpose of these images? This is something else I'll be sharing with the group too. Some of these images go back to 1890 in my collection. What else can I share with you quickly? I have a lot, but I'm not going to take up all the time. These are other images from history from 1890, and I will tell you all the way to today. You can go to Amazon and look at representations of Little Black Sambo where it is still being mass produced. This is Runaway Tots. This is the Mule Twins. This is Petunia Be Careful, which is a representation of the pickaninny. This is an anthropological look at the black child, and I use anthropological in quotation marks. This is the Pickaninny Twins. This is Topsy, and Topsy was just featured in Lovecraft Country. Can I get a hands up for Lovecraft Country? The Topsy Bopsy Twins. So my argument is, yes, this is a part of history, but it's also a part of the racial imaginations of today, and it is still evident in various forms of media literacy, especially when you look at the narratives of people on Amazon and their reviews of Little Black Sambo. It is a generational cycle about racial fantasies with African American children being objectified and dehumanized. So that's what I'm thinking about when you talk about question number one. So systems of literacy that also function as propaganda and oppression.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Amina. You're absolutely right. And both folks who have spoken, this ties into the topic earlier of this is both digital and still analog. We see these misrepresentations, this forced consumption of these misrepresentations in most media in our world, digital and on paper. So yes, does anyone else have a thought or idea they'd like to share?
And feel free to respond in the chat as well. Gary has posed a strong, perhaps critique, or maybe I'm misinterpreting of this idea of disruption. And so we can consider pieces that are shared in the chat as well.
So I'd like to just mention in terms of when I started to recognize systems of socialization, it was hard for me at first. And it's interesting that Gary kind of mentions this concept of disruption, because I grew up with a lot of privileges as a white male in upper middle class family. And so I didn't see a need for disruption because I was being represented everywhere I looked. And it wasn't until I started learning more about how to critically think and see how so many of the things that I've assumed are normal are not normal, and how negatively they impact so many other people who don't happen to be in the privileged, the select group. And so I think this notion of disruption is really important in terms of helping us understand systems and structures that are harming many people at the expense, benefiting a few at the expense of so many.
I'm going to tug on that thread that Jeff just pulled for us a little further and suggest that the algorithmic construction of our spaces online is yet another aspect to disrupt. My students and I will often critique this idea of authenticity, and particularly with regards to surveillance, data mining, and data personalization. So even if Jeff, as you described, you had a privileged upbringing, if you had that same upbringing now, your constructed reality is one that's largely based on this commercialization of you as a human being and of your data that could be disrupted and maybe should be disrupted in order for you to have an authentic experience of the world. So there's that other piece of it, perhaps. I'm going to jump in again with Gary's comment because I do appreciate it so much. And I welcome everyone to consider this comment as we move into the visual journaling and the creative piece, because the title of our session, this idea of visual journaling as creative care, as this arts-based radical practice, is a piece of the puzzle here. And I think the word disruption, and Jewel might have other ideas to share, is we're using it because we've seen a degradation of using student created art or inviting student voice in the classroom. Maybe not even a degradation, maybe it's simply just been missing for so long. And so when we invite that, it creates a bit of a disruption in the classroom. And it initially, I think, shocks students, and then there's this overwhelming enjoyment of learning that unfolds where they can share their voice that is so often not invited into the classroom.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think of disruption as like decentering, and getting uncomfortable. And so it might not be a nice term in my opinion, but it is one that helps us to lean into interrogating our own practices and how we center, our own teaching, how we decenter students, how we decenter marginalized experiences too. So I think it's a valid point, but I do think we need to use language that sometimes makes us a little not happy about it. But yeah, so I think Theresa's next part, where we'll move into the creative expression, I think will help to highlight this.
Just to add with what all you have said, right? I believe that something that is crucial is the what you mentioned about the teaching practices, and in order to make visible what is not visible. And once we are aware about the importance of the systems of socialization and the look, let's say the approach the media has to that, it is a need for educators to intervene there and to develop, in my opinion, not only in, let's say, an intercultural approach, but also to develop critical citizenship, right, in our students. And of course, as Paulo Freire, let's say, says, right, just to put into action what we call praxis, right, this reflection, right, and action all the time of our teaching practices. That is the way, in my opinion, right, to counteract and to create a tension between what is provided by media, right, and what we can do with that.
Feel free to keep the conversation going in the chat as well. I think we're on schedule to move into the next piece, and then we do have a closing discussion that is going to pull this all together. So in this segment, we'll focus more on the visual journaling piece. And what we have found in our work with visual journaling in a number of contexts, including academic contexts with undergraduate students, graduate students, and students outside of academic contexts. For instance, Jewel's done work with students through creativity and care workshops in the library, is that in these spaces, visual journaling serves as a democratizing pedagogy that centers their learning and for us, our scholarship, on our lived experiences. And so we'll share a few examples here. I have some from different context that includes student learning and our scholarship, in addition to some professional artists. And then following these examples, you will have an opportunity to try some visual journaling. And you can use whatever you have available to you, pens, paper, or even your computer if you have a program or a blank Word document even. And we'll get to that in a minute. Whoops, I forgot I wasn't sharing screen, Jewel. So here's some student examples. As Jewel mentioned in the beginning, visual journaling can rely on invitational prompts that give students a task or a creative constraint in how they shape their response that can be really helpful to get things started. And this is what I'll show you in the next slide. In this slide, we see student responses to readings about bias in technology with no prompt. And so without a prompt, students are free to engage in visual journaling using whatever media materials are comfortable or help them best express their voice. So I'll just share that in the drawing, the pencil drawing with the horse, the students talking about how we are blind in many ways to the bias that undergirds all technology that we use. And she chose to pull a quote from the drawing and then use the metaphor of the horse. The other students have chosen different materials and different approaches. And through this, the conversation that ensues is helpful for students because they're given insight into each other's perspectives in a way that they've described as comfortable for their sharing and learning. Let's see the next slide when you have a chance. This is student visual journaling from a class where students were given an opportunity to think about their experiences with representation and identity in the media, and students were given 15 to 20 cartoons that were distributed on the tables, and they could pull whatever one caught their attention and add a caption. So this is an example of a visual journaling prompt that offers a creative constraint. And students have very different perspectives that they then share and pull out. And again, they're looking at their neighbors and sharing with their peers and gaining insight into varied perspectives and experiences. We'll go to the next slide, which I think is from our scholarship. So in our Creativity Collaborative, we use visual journaling as part of our teaching, research, and scholarship. So the example on the left is a collaborative piece where I created a collage to represent my emerging research agenda related to creativity in the classroom. I passed the journal to my colleague, Martha, who then filled in with words. And so visual journaling can be individual, but it can also be shared so that students can, and I've done this in my classes as well, they might pass their journals throughout the classroom. I'll let Jewel speak on her image here.
Sure. And so I made this piece here representing my interpretation of how practicing creativity and self-care within a safe community empowers individuals to heal and cast their dreams. Academia is toxic and creating spaces where you can be vulnerable and be creative and have care is so radically powerful. And I made this piece to try to push that idea out.
And perhaps I'll just link back, although we'll have a discussion in a bit, I'll just link back to the comments about disruption in the chat and suggest that in our scholarly experience, we've talked a lot about our meetings as being kind of the in-between space. You have your academic meetings that you might go to, departmental, budget, ad hoc groups, et cetera, et cetera. But in many ways, we're not a person in those meetings. And when we come together as our creativity collaborative, we check in. We start with check-in. So we kind of are the in-between space. And in many ways, that's a literal disruption to our day where we can actually take a breath and feel seen. And so that's a piece of this creative work as well. So we'll go to the professional artist examples. And I share these as an opportunity to help prime us for the next piece where you'll have a prompt to consider a story you'd like to reclaim or remake or reimagine. And so Cheryl Rowland is an interdisciplinary artist. He's got a tremendous portfolio, but the project I'll share here is his jumpsuit project, where he worked to ignite conversations around issues related to incarceration in order to dismantle stereotypes and oppressive narratives. And he did that through a public art engagement, very active art project where he would wear the orange jumpsuit in a variety of public places and included a photography component to document those experiences. The next artist that we'll discuss is Tatiana Fazalizier, and her work has, in a similar way, been enacted in public spaces, and she addresses the oppressed oppressive experiences of women in particular in public spaces uh, through her street art. And these are large scale portraits that include quotes and personalized stories alongside them. And they can be found all over the world. And some of you maybe have her works in your communities. She has a book that came out in February that documents this particular project more fully. We'll go now to a sculpture artist. Justin Favela is a multidisciplinary artist, but he does installation and sculpture. And he uses crepe paper in the style of piñatas to encourage audiences to negotiate cultural stereotypes. And in his artist statement, he explains that he does this to dismantle institutional hierarchies, but his medium of choice is playful and accessible for audiences. So these are three artists who are reclaiming and reimagining through their works. And we'll invite you to do something similar in just a moment. Oh, I'm seeing some comments here in the chat. Thank you for those. Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so cool. See, I'm in Boone. It's quite small. We don't often get such big artists here. Here's our prompt for you today: to reclaim, remake, reimagine. So consider a story that you can reclaim, remake, or reimagine. What could that be? What could that look like? You might sketch, write, list words about your experiences, seeing yourself or not seeing yourself in media. However you wish to get started, you have an opportunity, about 15 minutes, to do some journaling related to visibility and stories that you might disrupt in the media. Now, I have some examples in the back burner, but I want to give folks a chance to consider their needs as they enter into this 15-minute period. So as Jewel had given an example earlier with her own reading, she then remade that in her workshops with Jennifer's library students. In the example Tempestt shared, perhaps your journaling is as simple as creating new headlines for stories that you see in the news. We're using a rather open prompt with you all today. I'm reading the rest of Allison's comments. So I'm not sure if we're ready to begin or not. Jewel, do you have anything to add? We're ready, we're digging in? Okay. So about 15 minutes, we'll keep the time. And then when we come back, we'll have an opportunity to discuss and we can share some of what we've created. I've got my paper here we can hold up, or discuss your ideas if you're not interested in sharing your journaling. We have about 2 minutes remaining before we regroup, and I see some folks are sharing their ideas in the chat already, and if you'd like to do that, you are more than welcome to do that. And then as we shared before in the first discussion, we can use chat and our audio as well. We'll go ahead and regroup. And often when we engage in visual journaling in our scholarly group, we will suggest that if you have an idea you're writing, you can write a few words to help you pick up where you left off when you rejoin your journal. Or if you are likewise, if you're doing a doodle, you might make a couple of notes, but finding a space, a way to wrap up. And already some folks are sharing and discussing their ideas in the chat. So again, we've got the chat available, and we also have our video camera so you can hold your journal up if you have something to show us and share with us, and we will open up to discussion.
So I'm willing to share mine if that's welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm Ajane. I'm a current PhD student, first year PhD student at the Annenberg School of Communication at University of Pennsylvania. And it's been a transition because I came from Teachers College. Hey, Lucius. And it's like completely reframing the way I think about media and media literacy and stuff like that. But anywho, during our first year, we have to do a professional seminar where every professor in the department comes to chat about kind of like what their research is. And we had a really interesting one yesterday where one of the political communication professors, like in a kind of hour-long rant about, you know, the election and politics, et cetera, like casually mentioned or like brought up this like fact that kind of seems to like reoccur during this election season about how if Black people had voted at the rates that they like usually vote on average, then Hillary Clinton would have won the last election. And of course, I'm always just like, what an interesting fact to cherry pick, because there are a lot of things that could have gone differently that would have led to Hillary Clinton winning the election, or whoever, you know, anyone other than Trump winning the election. So I kind of did some like collaging around that. And I basically, I don't know. So in the middle is obviously the White House. I keep like a stack of magazines around. So you're probably like, where did all this come from? But it's like, I don't know, I guess a part of my practice weirdly. And I guess like I was looking at, I like put this picture here of a Black woman just because like, I kind of feel like there's this like oh, here we go, a little closer. So yeah. there's like this like persistent but unnamed expectation for like Black people, especially Black women, to kind of like save our democracy, if you want to call it that at this point. And that was kind of me, I guess, responding there to that. And then I also, in one of my, like a lot of these magazines are my mom's old like Ebony and, you know, Essence magazines. And one of them was like, had a list of places where like Black businesses are thriving. And I was like, well, if there are places where Black businesses are thriving, it's probably a place where voter suppression is happening. And I did a bunch of like Googling while I was putting it together, and I was right. So these are also like some cities where voter suppression is happening. And I kind of, you know, wanted to take a little bit more of like a critical approach to talking about the election and voting and all of that good stuff than like, you know, simply pointing out that if Black people had voted more, that like things might be different. So that's my share.
Thank you for sharing that. That was amazing. I'm so glad to see your collage and to hear that you have magazines just around, like using
Thanks.
every anything can be used to express yourself, and that's such a great point. Yeah. And so I'm looking back at the chat too, but we welcome anyone else if they want to share or just chat out or speak. And I unshared the slides so we could see each other a little bigger.
I'll make a quick comment. Alexander shared, and his or her share, their share connects to Robin Wall Kimmerer's work in a really powerful ways. If some folks out here are familiar with Robin Wall Kimmerer's work in braiding sweetgrass, so something to consider. Other ideas, not just about the stories that are being reclaimed, but the process. So Allison has shared this idea of collective zine production in a gender and media studies class. And so again, this idea of working collectively on an expression is also not featured prominently in K-12 experiences or in college undergraduate experiences. So the process is really the most important aspect of this. And we didn't go into the whole history of visual journaling, but this is not about art. This is not about having art skills or talents or creating art or even an artful page. Visual journaling is about the process. It's a generative reflective process and about creating story.
I can go. So I have gone through a very almost ironic journey in my life where things that have influenced me as a child, which was education. I originally had auditory processing disorder as a child, and I had to go through a lot of adversity in academia and seeing what how special ed children are treated versus regular children are treated, and how that is a huge gap in curriculum as well. And then you can see how if you apply the same context to both children, they'll learn similarly as far as how we're applying curriculum today. I don't think that we're catering towards the student, and a lot of people are not able to find their identities early in childhood and able to claim those identities and recognize the history and the significance that have happened in their history, because that what is ingrained in us is our ancestry. Like what I connect with deeply is my Jewish identity, and I didn't understand that until I recognize that in my later years, how that trauma from past ancestry and recognizing the history behind that, and then recognizing the history living in America, how that changes your identity and how significant that is, and recognize the hierarchical systems that are ingrained in our society and how that has reached our education system, and it's now reached our youngest populations. And what I've really been become passionate about now that I'm in college, and now that I was able to find my passion was in school, and my passion was for learning. It was really easy for me to recognize like the school systems are just catered for teaching for the test and not teaching to find yourself in order to make the most out of this world and find your purpose to benefit all. And it's hard to see that in these systems that, you know, aren't catered towards actually helping the individual to help society. So it's hard for people to connect on an identity community level in order to help the greater world. And like kind of relating back to voting, I think that's like something that's so important that, you know, honestly mentioned, like with I really like what you created and have your magazines. That's honestly amazing because it's so true. We don't vote enough, and there's not enough people that there's this, no one's really speaking up except for the media, and that's how Trump got elected. He's loud. He, of course, like that's how we got elected. So hopefully we're seeing this reclaiming of, you know, online of, especially with like now in 2020 where everyone's like starting to reflect, I think, more on how things are changing. So for me, it's more reimagining how we're changing society and recognizing our past in order to find a better method in the future. So I think that's how hopefully we're changing in that direction. I'm hoping for that instead of getting lost in what media and the algorithms are happening right now. So that's my little thing.
Thank you, Amy. And I see Claudia has her hand up, so we can go with you, Claudia, and then we'll probably be out of time, but this is excellent, so I
No.
want to hear from you.
All right, no, I'll keep it short. I just want to share an experience, not someone in the chat was talking about an exercise I did with his students. And well, here in Colombia, we are so used to idealize the image of some people who have done a lot of harm, a lot of damage to the country, but a lot of people, through the influence of media, have idealized these people, and so younger generations they want to become them. Okay, so and they see only the positive side. So a couple of years ago, I was a primary school teacher, and with my fifth graders, we did an exercise in which we try to identify some of those, well, and we call them anti-heroes. Okay, the concept of, you know, the anti-hero was not very explored at the time here in Colombia, but they created stories in which they portrayed a real character, but in a different context with a different name, and through sharing like the bad things that these people had done, but in a different setting and in a different context, a lot of students started um, changing the image that they had of these idealized people. And curiously, one of the image that changed the most was one of the most horrible images that we have for the world, which was the image of Pablo Escobar. And that it turns out that a lot of these kids were um, had this image of Pablo Escobar as, oh yeah, such a good guy because he built neighborhoods in Envigado and he gave money to these people and he helped these other people, but they hadn't realized the amount of damage that he had done to the entire country. So they started changing through the stories that other classmates wrote about their own experiences. So I think this kind of exercises also have the power to change the image that we have of certain people, and well, and they can help us see reality a little bit better.
Thank you for sharing that, Claudia. I have some notes here in my visual journal from John Dewey in 1934, describing that the disruption of routine common sense ways of interpreting visual experience is a crucial part of the arts-based inquiry process. So it sounds like you invited your fifth graders to disrupt that visual experience that had kind of been permeating in their space as they grew up, and to reimagine that as a way of creating new future. It's exciting.
So we are at 2:30 and we want to be respectful of your time, but this has been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing with us and taking time to hear what we've been doing. I put into the chat a link to our slides again, and then a link to our collaborative's website so you can see a bit more information about us. And our contact information is on the slides too if you want to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you,
This
everyone.
was wonderful. I want to say if we could all maybe just unmute and give a big round of applause. It's so great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The way the conference is structured is we now have an hour break until the next session. So please go eat, go do whatever you want, and go to the next session. Thank you so much. And anybody who wants to hang around, I'm not going to close this off, so you can still talk for a little while.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. I will stop the recording though.